The permit clearly states no permanent structures.
This is permitted.
That wall is not allowed.
It is allowed. Look.
I am looking. It has to go.
No, it doesn't.
I understand what you're saying, but the only way we can make this work is the patio.
You ever wake up and realize someone destroyed something you can never replace? Chainsaws. Loud ones. Multiple engines revving hard through the morning fog. I threw on my boots and ran outside while the grass was still wet with dew. And the second I cleared the back porch, my stomach dropped. One of my pine trees was falling. A 70-foot ponderosa pine that had stood beside the shoreline longer than I'd been alive crashed into the dirt with this deep cracking sound that echoed across the water. Fresh sap hit the air instantly. You could smell it everywhere. That sharp pine smell mixed with wet soil and chain oil. Sprinted down the slope toward the lake and saw at least 6 contractors in neon vests cutting through my tree line like they were clearing a highway. Limbs were scattered everywhere. Birds were circling overhead. And standing near the shoreline with sunglasses on and a white travel mug in her hand was Linda Crawford, the president of our HOA. She looked completely relaxed, like this was a landscaping project she ordered for her backyard. I yelled, "What the hell are you doing?" And she actually smiled at me. Smiled. Then she pointed toward the lake and said, "People deserve to enjoy the view, Cole." I couldn't even process what I was hearing. Those trees blocked wind from the lake every winter. They gave my property privacy. My grandfather planted half of them himself after a wildfire back in the 70s. And now they were dropping one after another into the mud while this woman stood there sipping coffee like she was improving the neighborhood. I told the contractors to shut everything down immediately, but one of them looked nervous and avoided eye contact. Quietly said, "Ma'am told us the HOA approved removal." That's when something clicked in my head. The HOA didn't own a single inch of my land. Not 1 foot. And they definitely didn't have permission. Linda crossed her arms and said, "You should have complied with the notices months ago." Notices? She meant the letters she'd been taping to my mailbox for almost a year complaining that my trees blocked sunset views from the HOA clubhouse across the lake. I ignored every one of them because the trees were on my property, legally protected, and nowhere in county code did it say I had to cut them down so retirees could drink wine with a better view of the water. But Linda hated hearing the word no. And that morning, she decided to do something about it herself. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because what happened after I called the sheriff turned this entire neighborhood upside down. The sheriff showed up about 40 minutes later in a dusty county SUV, and by then the contractors had already cleared almost half my shoreline. Giant pine trunks were stacked beside the gravel road like firewood, and the entire lake looked wrong without the tree line. Sunlight hit parts of my property that had not seen direct light in decades. It felt exposed, empty. Linda walked over to the deputy before I could even speak and started acting like she was the reasonable one in the situation. She told him the HOA had been trying to resolve a compliance issue for months and claimed the trees were creating safety concerns and lowering neighborhood property values. I stood there covered in dirt and pine needles listening to this woman talk about my grandfather's trees like they were dead bushes behind a shopping mall. The deputy asked if the workers had permission to enter my property, and Linda immediately jumped in saying, "The board approved the maintenance action unanimously." Maintenance action? That was the phrase she used after destroying 20 years of privacy in a single morning. I told the deputy those trees were fully inside my property line and that nobody from the HOA had legal access to remove them. He looked uncomfortable the second he realized this was turning into a land dispute between a homeowner and an HOA board. Then he gave me the answer I already knew was coming. "Sir, this is probably going to end up as a civil matter." Civil matter. Meanwhile, chainsaws were still running 20 feet away from us. I remember looking down at the fresh tree rings on one of the stumps and realizing some of those trees were older than Linda herself. One contractor quietly packed up his equipment and left early without saying a word. The others avoided eye contact completely. Deep down, I think they knew something about this felt wrong. But Linda kept pushing forward because she thought money and authority could cover everything. Around noon, she walked over holding an envelope and tried handing it to me like she was doing me a favor. Inside was a check for $7,000 from the HOA reserve account. $7,000 for trees that protected my ranch for decades. I looked at her and asked, "You think this fixes it?" Because I was angry anymore, but because I realized something important. Linda genuinely believed she could take control of land she did not own simply because enough people agreed with her. By sunset, neighbors were already standing on their decks taking photos of the open lake view like they had just unlocked some luxury upgrade. Some even thanked Linda publicly online for improving the community. Nobody asked how it happened. Nobody cared whose property got destroyed to make it happen. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table staring out at the empty shoreline, while the smell of fresh pine still drifted through the open windows. Then I remembered something my grandfather told me years ago after a boundary dispute with another rancher. He said, "Never argue with people when the paperwork can do the talking for you." So around midnight, I unlocked the old steel safe in my hallway closet and started digging through every property document my family had kept since the 1970s. And buried underneath old survey maps and faded county records, I found something that made me stop breathing for a second. If you noticed anything that could have been better in this story or video, feel free to leave your feedback. We would love to improve and make the next video even better. The document I found was not sitting in some neat folder labeled property rights. It was folded inside an old waterproof envelope buried underneath tax records from the 1980s and handwritten notes from my grandfather. The paper itself smelled old, like dust and machine oil, and across the top in faded black ink were the words Boundary Adjustment Agreement, Kootenai County, 1978. I spread it across my kitchen table beside a lamp and started reading line by line while rain tapped against the windows. At first it looked like boring survey language, the kind of legal wording nobody pays attention to unless they absolutely have to. But then I saw the map attached to the back page, and suddenly everything made sense. The HOA clubhouse that everybody loved sitting at every summer evening was not where people thought it was. According to the original county survey, the structure itself sat correctly on HOA land, but the extended viewing patio built years later crossed 14 feet over the actual property line and onto my ranch. 14 feet. I must have measured that line on the map 10 times because I honestly could not believe it. Then I walked into the hallway closet and grabbed another file my grandfather kept labeled Shoreline Easement. That was when things became even more interesting. Back in the late 70s, before the neighborhood existed, my grandfather had signed a limited access agreement allowing temporary shoreline maintenance near the lake for future development. Temporary, not permanent ownership. And buried in the agreement was one sentence that changed everything. The landowner retained the right to revoke visual access structures at any time if the area interfered with private ranch operations. I leaned back in my chair staring at that line while the clock on the microwave flashed 12:47 a.m. Linda had spent almost a year trying to force me to remove my trees because she believed the lake belonged visually to the neighborhood. But legally, she had been standing on my property the entire time while ordering contractors onto my land. The next morning, I drove into town before sunrise and stopped at a small surveying office near the county courthouse. The owner, a gray-haired guy named Frank Delaney, looked over the old maps for less than 2 minutes before raising his eyebrows. He asked me where I got them, and when I explained the situation, he actually laughed under his breath and said, "Your HOA president is about to have a really bad month." Quiet. Because for the first time since those chainsaws started roaring outside my window, I realized I did not need to argue with Linda anymore. I did not need to yell at the HOA board or fight online with neighbors calling me selfish. The paperwork was stronger than any opinion they had. Later that afternoon, while driving back home along the lake road, I noticed something almost funny. The HOA had already placed a new promotional sign near the entrance of the neighborhood. It read, "Enhanced scenic lake views for all residents." Underneath the sign, someone had even planted fresh flowers around the base like they were celebrating a victory. I sat in my truck for a second staring at it while the sun reflected off the water where my trees used to stand. Then I smiled for the first time all week, because Linda Crawford had no idea what she had just handed me. Over the next 3 weeks, I did something that drove Linda absolutely crazy. Nothing. I did not threaten the HOA. I did not post angry comments online. I did not put up signs or argue with neighbors standing around admiring the open lake view where my trees used to be. Every morning, I just went back to work repairing fishing boats in my barn while the shoreline sat empty behind me. And that silence made Linda confident. Too confident. The HOA started acting like they had won some kind of war. Their monthly neighborhood newsletter suddenly featured photos of the lake at sunset taken directly from the clubhouse patio. One page even had the headline Improved Community Visibility Initiative in giant blue letters. I almost laughed when I saw it. Linda had actually turned the destruction of my property into a bragging point. Got worse. The HOA installed brand new patio furniture facing the water, added decorative string lights along the railing, and started advertising weekly wine nights to celebrate the restored panoramic views. So I waited, quietly, patiently. Meanwhile, Linda kept escalating. She started driving past my ranch twice a day in her white Lexus SUV, slowing down just enough for me to notice. One afternoon, she actually rolled down her window while I was stacking lumber near the barn and yelled, "Looks much better without all those trees, Cole." I just nodded and kept working. That response confused her more than anger ever could. See, people like Linda expect conflict. They feed off reactions. What they cannot handle is someone staying calm while they unknowingly walk deeper into a trap. About a month after the trees came down, the HOA held a lakeside social event on the clubhouse patio. Nearly the whole neighborhood showed up. Music played across the water while people took photos beside the railing during sunset. At one point, I could even hear Linda giving a speech thanking residents for supporting the board's vision for community improvement. 2 mornings later, everything changed. I woke up just after sunrise and heard the sound of engines near the lake again. But this time, it was not chainsaws. It was diesel trucks. I walked down toward the shoreline carrying a mug of coffee and saw 3 county survey vehicles parked beside the clubhouse. Men in reflective jackets were unloading tripods, measurement poles, and bright red marker stakes while confused residents gathered nearby whispering to each other. Linda came storming out of the clubhouse wearing slippers and a robe over her clothes, demanding to know what was happening. Frank calmly handed her a folded county notice without saying a word. I watched her eyes scan the paper once, then twice. The color drained out of her face so fast it honestly startled me. A few minutes later, one of the surveyors hammered a bright red stake directly through the edge of the HOA patio, while residents stood frozen in silence watching him do it. The moment that red survey stake went through the corner of the clubhouse patio, the entire mood around the lake changed. Residents who had spent weeks praising Linda suddenly stopped smiling, started pulling out their phones, whispering to each other, and staring at the painted boundary lines running directly beneath patio furniture the HOA had installed only a month earlier. Linda looked furious, but underneath the anger I could see panic starting to creep in. She marched straight toward Frank Delaney demanding answers while 2 HOA board members stood behind her looking completely lost. Then he explained, in front of everybody, that the expanded viewing patio had crossed onto my ranch property years ago during renovations and had remained there unnoticed ever since. Linda immediately snapped back, saying the HOA had maintained the space for over a decade and therefore had rights to it now. Frank just shrugged and said, "That argument would work better if your board had not recently trespassed onto the landowner's property and removed protected trees without authorization." You could almost hear the air leave the crowd after he said that. Suddenly nobody wanted to stand too close to Linda anymore. By that afternoon, the HOA emergency meeting had already been announced through neighborhood emails. Residents flooded the clubhouse parking lot demanding explanations, while Linda tried controlling the situation by insisting everything was under review. But she had another problem now. People had started realizing the new, improved lake view they celebrated might end up costing the entire neighborhood money. A lot of money. Around sunset, one of the board members named Greg walked up to my dock looking nervous. Greg had always been one of those quiet HOA guys who mostly nodded along with whatever Linda wanted. He shoved his hands in his pockets and awkwardly asked me what exactly I planned to do about the patio. I told him the truth. I have not decided yet. The look on his face told me that answer scared him more than any threat could have. Because uncertainty is torture when people know they made a mistake. The next few days became strangely quiet around the neighborhood. No more social events at the clubhouse. No more smiling Lakeview photos online. Linda stopped driving past my ranch entirely. Instead, HOA lawyers started sending me formal letters requesting meetings and cooperative resolution discussions. I ignored every single one for almost a week. Not because I wanted revenge right away, but because I wanted them sitting with the pressure for a while. I wanted every resident looking out across that beautiful open lake view wondering whether it was about to disappear. Then, early one Thursday morning, I finally made a decision. I drove into town and met with a local contractor named Ray Mercer who specialized in commercial privacy barriers and heavy steel installations. Ray looked over the property maps in silence for a few minutes before asking me one question. "You trying to make a statement or solve a problem?" I looked out his office window toward the mountains and said, "Both." "Matte finish. Industrial grade." And the second Linda found out about it, she completely lost control. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than I expected. By the time the steel containers arrived at the storage yard outside town, people were already posting photos of them in the HOA Facebook group asking whether they belonged to me. Linda completely spiraled. She started emailing every resident twice a day claiming I was planning an illegal retaliatory structure that would damage property values and violate community aesthetics. The funny part was that my ranch had never legally belonged to the HOA in the first place. That little detail suddenly mattered a lot now. 3 mornings later, the first delivery truck rolled onto my property just after sunrise. The sound alone drew people outside. Massive diesel engines growled across the quiet lake, while 40-foot matte black steel containers slowly backed down the gravel road toward the shoreline where my pine trees used to stand. You could hear metal chains rattling and hydraulic brakes hissing all across the water. Neighbors came out onto their decks holding coffee mugs, staring like they were watching a tornado form in real time. Linda arrived before the second truck even finished parking. She jumped out of her Lexus, still wearing slippers, and immediately started screaming at the contractor crew about permits and lawsuits. Ray Mercer barely looked at her. He just handed her a folded copy of the county approval paperwork and kept directing his crane operator. That made her even angrier. She stormed toward me while I stood near the dock and demanded to know what I thought I was doing. Told her exactly what I told Ray. Solving a privacy problem. Her face turned bright red when she realized what that meant. The first container lifted into the air around 9 o'clock that morning. The crane cables tightened with a loud metallic groan, and slowly this enormous black wall rose above the shoreline where the trees had once stood. Every person watching from the clubhouse patio suddenly lost their perfect lake view for a few seconds while the container swung into place. Then it lowered directly onto reinforced concrete footings sitting entirely inside my property line. Completely legal. Completely permanent. Linda immediately called the sheriff again. This time she also called county code enforcement, the zoning office, and apparently 2 attorneys because by noon 3 separate vehicles had arrived at my ranch. The neighborhood looked like some kind of emergency scene. Residents lined the road whispering while inspectors walked around measuring setbacks and checking permits. I stayed calm the entire time because I already knew the answer they were going to give her. Around 1 o'clock, the lead county inspector finally approached Linda in front of everybody. He adjusted his glasses, looked down at the paperwork one more time, then said the sentence that completely shattered her confidence. "Mr. Bennett is fully compliant with county land use regulations." You could actually hear people gasping nearby. Linda tried arguing that the structure was excessive and intentionally disruptive, but the inspector stopped her immediately and reminded her that private property owners were legally allowed to install approved privacy barriers on their own land, especially after documented trespassing disputes. The second he said that, several residents slowly turned and looked directly at Linda. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, she looked genuinely afraid. By sunset, 3 full containers stood side by side along my shoreline like a massive black wall stretching across the edge of the lake. The open panoramic view the HOA had celebrated for weeks was gone. Completely gone. And while residents stood silently staring at steel instead of water, Ray walked over beside me, folded his arms, and quietly asked. I looked across the lake at the clubhouse patio sitting partially on my land and said, "Not even close." The next week was absolute chaos around the lake. Every morning, I woke up to new complaints flying across the neighborhood like smoke after a wildfire. Residents who had spent months praising Linda suddenly wanted answers about legal fees, property boundaries, and why the HOA board had apparently approved contractors to enter private land without permission. The clubhouse parking lot stayed full almost every evening because emergency meetings kept getting scheduled back to back. Could hear arguments spilling out through the open windows all the way across the water. And right in the middle of all of it stood that massive black wall blocking the exact lake view Linda had destroyed my trees to create. The irony was almost beautiful. But things became even worse for the HOA after local real estate agents started talking. One agent posted online that homes advertised with premium panoramic lake views might now require updated listings because several sightlines had become obstructed. Single post sent the neighborhood into panic mode. Homeowners began calculating potential value losses. Some blamed me. Most blamed Linda. One couple actually showed up outside the clubhouse demanding the HOA pay for a canceled home sale because buyers no longer wanted a property facing a steel barrier instead of open water. Linda tried controlling the situation by holding another board meeting where she claimed the wall was temporary and that the HOA legal team was preparing immediate action against me. Problem was that none of it was true. I knew it. And eventually the residents figured it out too. Because every attorney the HOA contacted kept giving them the same answer. My structures were legal. My land rights were valid. And after the unauthorized tree removal, the county was not exactly sympathetic toward the HOA board anymore. Then came the financial disaster. One afternoon, Greg knocked on my barn door looking exhausted. He told me the HOA reserve fund had already burned through nearly $80,000 between attorneys, survey disputes, emergency meetings, and insurance consultations. Residents were furious because annual dues were about to increase. Some homeowners were openly threatening lawsuits against the board itself. Linda apparently spent entire meetings blaming everyone except herself. According to Greg, she even claimed I had manipulated the situation from the beginning. That almost made me laugh. Linda had every chance to stop this before it started. All she had to do was leave my property alone. Instead, she treated private land like a community decoration project. Around that same time, Ray returned with another crew and began reinforcing the steel barrier with permanent anchoring systems. The sound of welding echoed across the lake for 2 straight days while sparks flashed behind the black panels at sunset. Residents watched from their balconies in complete silence. Nobody celebrated the lake view anymore because there was no lake view left to celebrate. One evening I walked down to the shoreline carrying a cup of coffee and noticed something strange. The HOA had stopped using the clubhouse patio entirely. Patio chairs sat empty. String lights remained off. Even the decorative flower planters Linda installed had started wilting in the sun. The whole area looked abandoned now, like some failed luxury resort no one wanted to visit anymore. Then, just when I thought the situation could not possibly become more embarrassing for Linda, another certified county letter arrived at the clubhouse. This one informed the HOA that because the patio partially encroached onto my land, any future use of the structure would require formal permission from the property owner, me. And the second residents found out about that letter, the HOA board completely turned on Linda Crawford. Once the residents learned the HOA legally needed my permission just to keep using their own clubhouse patio, the entire neighborhood atmosphere turned toxic overnight. People who used to defend Linda suddenly wanted her removed from the board immediately. Homeowners started demanding copies of every legal bill, every contractor invoice, every email connected to the tree removal. Some residents even questioned whether the HOA insurance policy would cover unauthorized actions taken on private property. Nobody trusted the board anymore. And through all of it, Linda kept making the same mistake she had made from the beginning. She refused to admit she was wrong. Instead of apologizing, she doubled down harder than ever. One afternoon, she actually sent a neighborhood-wide email claiming I was weaponizing land ownership against the community. That message backfired instantly. Residents were already furious about rising dues and collapsing property values, and now they had written proof showing Linda still thought she was the victim. Greg later told me people started shouting during board meetings the second her emails got mentioned. One homeowner reportedly slammed a folder onto the table and yelled, "None of this would have happened if you had just left his trees alone." That was the exact moment the board lost control of the neighborhood completely. But while everybody else focused on the steel wall, I was already thinking years ahead. Because temporary revenge was not enough for me anymore. I wanted permanent protection. I never wanted another HOA president, future board member, or entitled neighbor thinking they could interfere with my property again. So I met with a land use attorney in Coeur d'Alene named Rebecca Sloan, who specialized in rural easements and long-term land restrictions. We sat in her office overlooking the river while she reviewed the old shoreline agreements, survey maps, and county records spread across her conference table. After almost an hour, she looked up at me and asked, "You want privacy forever?" I told her yes. 2 weeks later, the next phase started. Large trucks began delivering mature cedar trees to my ranch. Not little decorative trees from a garden center either. These were massive 20-foot cedars with thick root balls wrapped in burlap. Residents watched in disbelief as crews lined them up behind the steel containers all along the shoreline. The smell of fresh soil and cedar filled the air for days while excavators carved irrigation trenches across my property. Then came the real shock. Rebecca officially filed a permanent privacy covenant with the county tied directly to the ranch deed. The covenant legally protected the future tree barrier and restricted visual access disputes connected to shoreline privacy use. In simple terms, no future HOA board could challenge it. Ever. The moment that filing became public record, the remaining support for Linda disappeared. Even the board members who once followed her blindly started distancing themselves. Nobody wanted their names connected to the disaster anymore. One evening, while crews finished planting the final row of cedars behind the black wall, I noticed movement near the clubhouse across the lake. Residents were gathering again, but this time nobody looked relaxed. Voices echoed across the water for nearly an hour. Then, right before sunset, I watched Linda walk out of the clubhouse carrying a cardboard box filled with papers and framed photos. She avoided eye contact with everyone around her while loading the box into the trunk of her Lexus. Nobody helped her. Nobody stopped her. She drove away slowly with the lake hidden completely behind the steel wall and the new cedar trees already rising above it. By the beginning of fall, the entire shoreline looked completely different from the way it had the morning Linda ordered my trees cut down. The black steel barrier still stretched across the property line, but now the cedar trees behind it had started filling out, creating a thick wall of green that swayed gently whenever wind rolled off the lake. The smell of fresh cedar replaced the sharp scent of cut pine that haunted the property for weeks after the destruction. Everything felt quiet again, peaceful, like the ranch had finally healed. Across the water, though, the HOA looked like a neighborhood trying to forget something embarrassing happened. The clubhouse patio stayed mostly empty now because there was no panoramic sunset left to admire. The string lights Linda installed had been removed. The flower boxes dried up and disappeared. Even the giant entrance sign advertising scenic lake views quietly vanished one weekend without anyone mentioning it. People stopped talking about community improvement after their HOA dues increased almost 30% to cover legal expenses and insurance problems tied to the trespassing incident. Greg eventually told me 3 different homeowners were considering separate lawsuits against the former board members for financial negligence. Linda herself never returned after resigning. About 2 months later, I heard she sold her house at a loss and moved closer to Spokane. Nobody around the lake seemed interested in defending her anymore. One evening near the end of October, I walked down to my dock carrying a fishing rod and a thermos of coffee just before sunset. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the orange sky behind the mountains. For the first time in months, I could sit there without hearing arguments echo across the neighborhood. No emergency HOA meetings. No lawyers. No chainsaws. Just wind moving softly through the cedar branches. I remember looking toward the other side of the lake where the clubhouse sat hidden behind the barrier and thinking about how all of this started because someone could not accept hearing the word no. Linda believed authority meant ownership. She believed an HOA title gave her the right to control property that was never hers. And in the end, that arrogance destroyed her reputation, fractured the neighborhood, drained the HOA financially, and permanently erased the exact lake view she was so desperate to protect. Meanwhile, I still owned my ranch. I still sat beside the same lake my grandfather loved. The only difference was that now nobody could ever interfere with my property again. The privacy covenant stayed attached to the deed permanently. The cedar trees would grow taller every year. And long after people forgot Linda Crawford's name, that green wall would still stand along the shoreline reminding everyone exactly what happens when entitlement crosses a property line. Biggest reason Linda failed was simple. She confused personal preference with legal authority and believed public support would protect her from consequences. The reason I won was because I stayed calm, relied on documentation instead of emotion, and understood that property rights matter more than neighborhood opinions. The biggest lesson people should take from this is that temporary power can make arrogant people reckless, but patience, preparation, and knowing the law will always outlast somebody trying to control what they do not own. If you have ever dealt with difficult neighbors, HOA problems, or someone crossing boundaries they had no right to cross, leave a comment and share your story because situations like this happen more often than most people realize.
I've never seen a better sunset here. It's just perfect.